everyone, thank you for coming. As Michelle mentioned, this talk is going to both address why animal advocacy matters to us as effective altruists and explore some of the best ways that we have to help other animals. So, as effective altruists who are interested in eliminating as much suffering as we can, it's really important that we consider suffering irrespective of who it's happening to. So this means that we care about individuals who are geographically distant from us, or individuals who maybe haven't been born yet, but who our actions will nonetheless impact. And it means that we care about someone's suffering regardless of that individual's sex, race, or species. And as effective altruists, it's also very important for us to update our views when we encounter new evidence so that we can actually do more good. So, a very useful framework for assessing a broader cause area is to figure out what the scale of the problem is, which is to say how many individuals are affected and how severely are they suffering, and to assess how neglected the area is, how much funding or other resources are we putting into it compared to what else we're doing, and how tractable are these problem solutions. So, in terms of scale, we farm and kill over 100 billion animals, sentient animals, every year, and the vast majority of these animals who we farm are in what we call factory farms. So the scale of this problem really dwarfs the issues of other animals who we use in other industries, and testing and circuses, and it dwarfs the number of stray companion animals, so this is where we're going to focus our attention today. If you are unfamiliar with the experiences of farmed animals, here is a brief overview of what most of them experience, and I'm just going to run through a couple of these. So they're all intensively confined and live in very crowded, unsanitary, and psychologically unhealthy environments. Many of them also suffer health complications from breeding. So for instance, the chickens who we raise for their flesh are bred to grow to obesity in their infancy, which, as we know, causes many health issues. And the chickens, like those pictured here, who we use for their eggs, we've bred them with these hyperactive reproductive systems so that they can lay 250 to 300 eggs a year instead of the 15 or so that their ancestors did. And this leaves them very prone to issues like ovarian cancer, to stuck eggs, to broken eggs, and infections. And many of these birds will die premature and extremely awful deaths before they are depopulated and killed because of these issues. And of course, all of these animals in every single animal industry are killed, many of them by way of asphyxiation, and a lot of them by drowning in boiling water due to errors on a very fast processing line. In terms of neglectedness, and these are American numbers because that was what was easy to find, Americans donate most of their money to domestic issues, some to international affairs, much less to local animal shelters, and very little to farmed animals. And this figure, which is $20 to $50 million to farmed animals, includes both welfare advocacy directed at corporations and directed at politicians and the law, as well as vegan and vegetarian outreach efforts, and it includes the costs of maintaining sanctuaries for animals who have been rescued from farms. So another way to look at neglectedness, instead of in total, is in terms of how much money are we giving in terms of how many people are receiving it. So we still donate most of our money to Americans. We donate less than $5, potentially substantially less, to each human living in poverty in the world. That's based on the International Affairs donation amount. We donate substantially more to stray dogs and cats within our own country. And we only donate 1 to 5% of a penny for every animal who is suffering in a factory farm. So we have really good reason to believe in and be confident of the tractability of either ending farmed animal suffering or making great progress against it, because there have been other social movements in history that have been against some form of discrimination or mass exploitation that have been extremely successful. For instance, the anti-slavery movement, women's suffrage, and gay marriage have been movements that we've seen only in the last couple of centuries, where we went from something that was really horrible, that was considered normal, to just a few generations later, we think it was this terrible, awful thing, and we have no intention of ever going back to it. So in terms of interventions that we are working on for farmed animals right now, a really popular one is leafleting and online ads to create consumer changes. So these are leaflets and ads that say, here's what happens on factory farms, this is why and maybe how you should go vegan or vegetarian. And the independent charity evaluator called Animal Charity Evaluators estimates that online ads will spare somewhere between 1 and 13 years of factory farm suffering, specifically of battery cage suffering, per euro, that was incorrect, 1 to 13 years of factory farm suffering per euro donated, and this is kind of high uncertainty, which is why we will discuss other interventions. So another very popular intervention over the last few years, this one is specific to the change from battery cages to cage-free situations, is corporate welfare reform campaigns to reduce the suffering that is happening on farms right now, rather than trying to cut down the number of animals that are farmed, just trying to cut down the suffering of the animals who are farmed. So Animal Charity Evaluators estimates that €1 donated to these programs will spare 13 to 28 years of factory farm suffering, which is specifically battery cage suffering, per euro donated to these campaigns. And we have more certainty about this number. And I should clarify that this number is based on the assumption that a cage-free farm is about 90% as bad in terms of suffering as a battery cage farm. And all of those bullet points that I listed for factory farm suffering earlier, those happen to cage-free birds. They're just not also in this tiny little cage that they can't open their wings in. So another important thing to consider is that, as with a lot of kind of near-term interventions that we can see the near-term effects of pretty robustly and easily, it can be hard to assess what their longer-term impacts are. So for instance, for these cage-free and other corporate welfare reform campaigns, as well as legislative welfare reform campaigns, there's a question of, do they help us, do they make us more complacent and make us feel like there's less urgency to the issue because we have made it a little bit better? Or do they help us with momentum and make us think, oh, okay, well, we've made some progress and that's really exciting and now we want to make more progress? So that is uncertain. My own feeling is that this leans slightly towards momentum, but we do need more research on this. A very promising intervention for farmed animals is the development of animal-free foods to entirely displace animal products. So these can be plant-based meat or dairy alternatives, such as soy milk, which has taken over a substantial chunk of the dairy industry already, or it can be cultured animal products. So this is a cultured meatball made by Memphis Meats, an organization in the United States, a company in the United States. And this is made by taking cells from an animal and growing them in a suitable growth medium until they've multiplied enough that you can make a meatball or a patty out of them. So theoretically, this would mean that you can just take cells from an animal one time, from an alive animal who just has to be pricked with a needle, and then for the rest of forever, you have enough cells to create all the meat and meatballs that you want. Another very important form of intervention is investigations. So most of us are very intimately involved with what happens on factory farms and in industrial slaughterhouses, but we don't notice it. We determine what happens in those places based on the decisions that we make throughout the day, but we're so removed from it. When we see an egg or a chunk of somebody's flesh, we don't even recognize that as somebody's flesh, and we definitely don't see what she went through, what her experience at the slaughterhouse or the factory farm was like. So these investigations help us to understand what these animals are going through and why it's so important. I would like to take a moment to discuss wild animals suffering. So there are a lot of animals in the wild, and many of them suffer from predation, starvation, disease, exposure, and other really awful causes of suffering. And this issue is almost entirely neglected. There are very few organizations trying to figure out what we can really do to help animals. There are some organizations that rehabilitate individual wild animals, and there are some organizations that focus on things like biodiversity and ecosystems and populations, but those aren't necessarily in the interests of the well-being of actual individual sentient animals. So research in this area is potentially very high impact. If we could find ways to help these animals robustly and account for all of these very complicated ecosystem interactions, then we could potentially help trillions of animals or even more. And one thing that we can also do right now is to just generally spread concern for these animals, and instead of talking about maybe ecosystems or biodiversity, have a little more interest in talking about the actual welfare and well-being of individual animals, so that sometime in the future, if we have the technological capacity or the computing power to actually figure out what we can do to really help these animals, then we do actually make those decisions in their interests. Sometimes I hear the objection that, well, I am not the one who made the wild animals suffer. I have some, complicity in the suffering of farmed animals because this is something my society and my culture is doing to these animals, but I'm not the reason that the lion is eating the elephant or that the mouse got this horrible neurological disease. But I want to put forward that to someone who is suffering of, say, starvation, it doesn't matter to them whether I am withholding food from them or whether they just can't get it for some other reason. Maybe they're very poor, maybe they're in a desert. All that really matters to them is that they're starving, they're hungry, and they're suffering. And their suffering is the same either way. So whether I caused it or not, if I can do something about it, I think I have a responsibility to do so, because what matters is just that they're suffering, not that I caused it or not. An intervention that could potentially help all animals is the pursuit of legal personhood. So this is based on the idea that if other animals have legal rights, just like we do, say rights to their own lives, to their own bodies, rights to mental and physical integrity, then we can much more robustly protect their interests because they won't be subordinate to our own, which they are now. So some groups, including Sentience Politics, where I work, and the Non-Human Rights Project in the United States, are working to achieve some degree of legal rights for primates as a foot in the door kind of strategy to help all animals. So in our last few minutes, I would like to run over a few messaging tips. The first, and potentially most important, is that I think the animal advocacy movement could really use a shift in framing from this kind of individual message to an institutional message. And what I mean by this is instead of saying, you need to go vegan or you need to go vegetarian, instead saying, we need to end animal farming, and having this as the message and the goal. And there are a few reasons I think that this is important. First of all, the institutional framing puts the focus more on the victim's needs than on the abuser's choices. It's more about how this chicken is suffering and ending her suffering than it is about what I choose to do in my daily life. It also helps us avoid defensiveness because instead of us being the bad guys, it's the institution of animal farming. Excuse me. And this enables us to participate in moral outrage. And moral outrage is really important for social movements because it has been shown to reduce system justification or status quo justification and really helps us get past what we're doing right now and push on to a new paradigm. The institutional framing also gives us this really inspiring vision. It gives us a vision of a world without factory farms, without industrial slaughterhouses, without slaughterhouses at all, which can be much more motivating to us than when we think about our own individual impact. So maybe if I'm vegan, I'm sparing 100 or so animals from factory farms every year compared to how I otherwise might have eaten, but there are still billions of animals suffering on these farms. So in my flawed human mind, I get overwhelmed by that suffering that is happening that I am not able to do anything about, and that can really stifle what I can do for the animals. But if I have this vision of a world with no factory farms and no slaughterhouses, I am much more inspired to push towards that future. And very importantly, the institutional messaging is strongly precedented by successful social movements. So most social movements that have been successful have gone straight for the institutional message, but there have been a couple of exceptions, and I think these exceptions are reasons to think that the institutional framing is still better. So for example, in the anti-slavery movement, there were some activists early on who were involved in what was called the free produce movement, which was, they were saying boycott slave-made goods, just buy goods that have not been produced through slave labor. And eventually they changed their tune and decided, no, forget this consumer thing, we just need to abolish slavery, we just need to end the institution. And that is when they started having much more success. It is also potentially the case that this has been part of the reason that the environmentalist movement is having such a hard time. So most environmentalist messaging is focused on, take shorter showers, eat less meat, drive a hybrid car. And it's possible that that focus on what you do as an individual is really stifling the momentum that we could use to push for change in the industry or at the legislative level. And I should also point out that within the institutional framing in this messaging and this new form of goal, consumer action is still intrinsically valuable, of course, because of those 100 or so animals a year you get to help, but it also becomes very politically useful. Instead of just being a personal choice, it's you refusing to participate in this system that is so awful and that we think needs to just come to an end. Another tip is to be kind and professional, but also to be bold. So we want to push people away from the status quo, but we don't want to push them so hard that they recoil and our efforts just backfire. So there is some kind of sweet spot between being so aggressive that they recoil and so indulgent that the status quo is just maintained or even reinforced. There's some space in between that where we're really motivating people and where change happens. A very important messaging tip is to put individuals first and numbers second. I have not done this in this presentation because I think this audience is particularly well suited to thinking about numbers and scale. But for most people, and probably for quite a few people in this audience too, it's very important to have individual stories so we can empathize with these individuals. So for instance, on the left is Lewis. She is a young turkey who was rescued from a turkey farm a few months ago. She's hanging out with her friend Ethel, the pig who was rescued from a lab, and they are at a sanctuary. They are going to be safe for the rest of their lives. Industry can't touch them now. And if I know Lewis, if I have met her, or if I have heard her story, it is much easier for me to empathize with these thousands of faceless individuals in the photo on the right. And this is a turkey farm. You might not be able to see it from there, but there are just so many, and I can't even really pick out any of their faces. I don't know who they are. So if I really understand who Lewis is and I care about Lewis, if I care about the one, it is much easier for me to care about the 100 billion. And last but not least, show not just why, but also how. So we show people why factory farming, why animal farming matters, why it's this important issue that we need to stop. We can give them these individual stories. We can show them what factory farms look like. But then once they have that motivation, we need to give them something to do with it. So for you right now, here are some things that you can do. You can join the Effective Animal Activism group on Facebook and have discussions about how to do effective advocacy. You can participate in research and discuss in spaces like that Facebook group. For instance, you can write a blog post on the successful or unsuccessful movements that have happened in the past and what tactics they've used. You can also donate to the organizations with the highest expected value, and if this is something that you have not thought much about, then I would recommend starting with Animal Charity Evaluators recommendations. If you are more interested in building research and capacity for animal advocacy that is specifically focused on doing the best advocacy that we can, then I would recommend donating to Animal Charity Evaluators or to Sentience Politics. If you are inclined to earn to give, which is to say intentionally pursuing a high-paying job so that you can donate a substantial part of your income, then that can be very high impact too. So if you can donate a whole salary or multiple salaries to high impact organizations, then those people are having impact that just otherwise wouldn't have been able to happen without you. So you are responsible for some of that impact, and that can be extremely valuable. You can also look for talent gaps in direct work. So if there are high impact organizations that have a particular job opening that need a particular role filled, and you are very well suited to that role, and maybe they're having a very hard time filling that role, they can't find the right person. If you are the right person for that job, then you can have an extremely high impact there too. So thank you for coming, and please feel free to reach out to me on Facebook, email, whatever, and let's open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for this inspiring speech. Now we have time for about 3 questions before we go to the lunch break. So are there any questions in the room for Kelly? Yes, in the back there.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for putting the I say, victims first with your talk. And just one question we had recently about, is there or are there changes that are made possible through like moral thoughts or pushing through moral issues, and not just like getting to a small step like animal welfare in order to get animal rights or the rights of all sentient beings?
So you mean like in terms of interacting with individuals and getting them more morally on board, or you mean on the movement level, trying to make changes to make people care more?
Yeah, on the movement level, like were there changes in the past for any kind of movement, not just animal rights movement?
Yeah, so this is the question with welfare advocacy, is does it help us create that momentum? I think also just generally having more memes, more ideas spreading around about ending animal farming can really help normalize that for people, or ideas about caring about wild animals, anti-speciesism more broadly. Just sharing these ideas around with people in your community especially makes it more normal for them and more accessible for them. And that has been really important in like all social movements, is knowing people within your own community who care about this so that it is much more accessible to you.
Okay, the next question over here.
Do you have any statistics about how much the wild animal suffering outnumbers the farming suffering?
Yeah, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but if you want to check out the website reducingsuffering.org, the author there has done some estimates of this. There are trillions of animals suffering in the wild, and it can be hard to assess just how much they're suffering, but we do know that the problem is massive.
Okay, the last question over here.
Thank you. My question is, you talked about individual and institutional activism, and you said institutional is better. And what could you suggest to do in this institutional activism?
So I know that this was a pretty hard spot for me too. So when we like approach people, when we talk to them about how bad animal farming is, the goal of like just don't eat animals seems so easy. It seems like just like the obvious place to go to. And it's much harder to instead say, we need to end animal farming, so can you like donate to these organizations? Can you get involved with these groups? It is a much harder ask right now, at least, when this is not the focus of the animal rights movement. But if we do shift the movement's kind of narrative and goals and messaging to be more about just ending animal farming entirely, then I think it will be much easier for people to get on board with just supporting different organizations, or maybe at least if they want to do something directly like not eat animals or not eat animal products, we can still frame that in this way of being more of a political message than like the thing that helps, because instead of helping just 100 animals, right now, it's more important because it's about helping all of the animals, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Sorry. I don't know. Did that answer your question? I don't know if that was sufficient. Okay.
I see another question there. Maybe we could do this last one. Is that okay with you,
Yeah.
Kelly? Okay.
Where do you think is the higher expected value, for example, in donating, if you go and alleviate suffering directly, or through changes in policies from companies, or by shifting or changing the moral of society?
So I think that where society is in terms of caring about animals is like already where it needs to be. If you look at Gallup polls, like people already agree that factory farming sucks. The majority of people even agree that animals should have the same rights as humans. So I think morally we're pretty much there. It's just a matter of changing our institutions to actually like match, here's like where we are morally, here's where we are like actually, and we just need to change our behavior and our institutions to match. So I think the historical precedent is really for policy changes and social momentum, you could say. So like it's not the case that everyone who cared about gay marriage was involved directly in the legal advocacy there, but they talked about it with their friends and they made other people care, and that helped the legal advocacy get pushed through.